Our mind is focused on the object of fear, and we ruminate about it in order to try and figure out how to get out from underneath it. And so what he does is he just suggests something, especially to men of sensitive conscience. Once the impure thought is then suggested, they react in fear, like I could fall here, and that's the hold that he has. Rather than it having the person immediately turning to God or to Our Lady and saying, I have perfect confidence in you. So these subtle things, that's how they can start out very subtly. So the very lowest levels are subtle forms of temptation. And then they can actually work up through it. But diabolic warfare is not just in relationship to temptation. I'm going to go through the higher levels, but we're going to talk about how it applies to us in our own particular lives. The next level is dolor, which is not going to apply to us. That's when they attack the saints physically. It doesn't apply to us. If it does, come see me, because you'd be the only case I've ever authentically seen of it. I've read about them, but I've never seen them. All right. Then the next level is oppression. This is where they attack people from the outside. Now, there's two forms of oppression, and I've never talked about this before, but Father asked me to talk about stuff in relationship to the upcoming elections. And this is how it plays in. This next level of diabolic influence or spiritual warfare, oppression, is where the demons attack you from the outside. This is when they attack your relationships, your finances, they attack your property, sometimes your health, things of that sort. So in one particular case, in Memphis, they think I have the gift of healing, which is absurd. I have no charismatic gifts whatsoever. People say, you're an exorcist, what gift do you have? Nothing. I got nothing, right? And I'm serious. I've walked into complete and fully infested houses. I'm like, oh, nope, looks good to me, right? Okay. So, and then I prayed, and then of course things happened, but the point being is that I have no sensitivities in that regard. So that being said, so they brought this man who had 4th stage pancreatic cancer to me, and they said, would you be willing to pray over him? And I said, sure. Now, I don't have the gift of healing, but I did a minor exorcism over him. A week later, he was cancer-free. A year later, they brought him back. He had some other weird illness, so I prayed over him. That was gone a week later. And so I finally told him, you're under some kind of a curse. This is a form of oppression, right? So there's curses, which is a kind of a higher form of oppression, but there's kind of curses. And the curses are basically designed to influence people in the negative. But the oppression can be in a variety of different ways. Now, there's a twofold distinction in relationship to oppression. There's indirect oppression, and there's direct oppression. Direct oppression is when they actually attack your particular life. They attack you, your health, your relationships, your finances, how things are operating within your home, etc. So they attack you directly. But then there's a certain level of spiritual warfare that all of us deal with, where we have to deal with the indirect fallout from oppression. This is when things like politicians and things like that, who are under the influence of the diabolic, who do essentially evil things. Let's cut to the chase. We are not living in a political atmosphere where there are differences of ideas. We are living in a political atmosphere where it's good on one side and evil on another. It's not a matter of differences of ideas. The ideas that they throw out are just to promote their evil. It's that simple. If you cut to the chase of it and get down to the bottom of it, there's certain people that are just nefarious. They're just doing evil things. And how do you know this? Every single thing they do maximizes damage within the context of what they're able to do. This is the type of thing that actually ends up affecting us. It is not rocket science. In fact, it's stuff that you can actually read about right on the internet, that there are actual politicians, international politicians, and even some in this country, who are actually involved in Satanism and witchcraft. It's not rocket science. And you can tell it by the stuff that they do. Okay, I'm not going to name names. I can see it now. It'll be all over the newspapers. But the point being is that we have to recognize that this indirect oppression that we suffer is when other people do evil things to get demons involved in culture, in society, in the church. It's not a rocket science to see that there's a fundamental problem with evil in the church right now. When you have bishops and cardinals coming out saying that it should be okay for two men to enter into some type of civil contract with each other, there is something fundamentally wrong and evil that's going on in the church. Okay. That being said, these are the things that we have to suffer. We're all suffering indirectly this spiritual warfare that's occurring at that level. It's very intense. Some of the most intense places of spiritual warfare that we end up having to deal with, and this is, again, sometimes it's in the parish, at the upper levels of the parish, sometimes the priest gets attacked. It's at the diocesan levels. The vitriol, the absolute hatred that demons have for bishops, when you see them talking about bishops in possession cases, the hatred they have for them is palatable. You can literally see the hatred they have for them. At the level of the Vatican, it's all where the warfare, we're all suffering from this warfare that's going on at that level, and that's a form of indirect oppression. What we have to recognize, of course, is that the church is indefectible. Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It doesn't mean that that members can't become really sinful. It doesn't mean that we can't have a Holy Father spouting things that are very odd and strange and even contrary to the faith, because the church itself has said it's only under these conditions that we know that he is infallible and is going to tell us what we know to be the truth, necessarily. Doesn't mean we ignore him, etc. It just means that we have to have a clear understanding of our faith, and that's a very important point. One of the principal ways to combat in spiritual warfare is you have to know your faith. It's not good enough just to say a few prayers here and there. You have to continually learn about your faith so that you don't get sucked into this indirect oppression. Because if you don't, it's so toxic. Modernism, which is now the heresy in the church, is so toxic. It's so much in the air that unless you have a special grace or unless you really know your faith extraordinarily well, you are simply going to end up in error. It's that simple. So you have to pray for God for that. But this is an indirect spiritual warfare that we all have to deal with. We all have probably experienced this, right? When you sit here and you read some of the stuff that's going on, that's coming out of the Vatican, or some of the things that these cardinals are saying, or some of the things that the bishops are saying and doing, and then the whole pedophilia scandal and all this other stuff that's going on, and then the fact that they were shuffling this around, this is a burden to a good Catholic. And this is the suffering, and this is exactly the kind of attack that the demons are willing to get. If they can't get to you directly, they're willing to take you down by having you despair or give in to discouragement or disappointment or even scandal in relationship to the church. What, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas says there's two kinds of scandal: active scandal, which is when you actually do something that's scandalous. But then there's passive scandal. And what does that mean? It means when you see somebody do something evil and it causes you to sin or to lose your faith. And he says that is sinful. It doesn't matter what these people do. It doesn't matter what anybody does. It doesn't matter what any priest, bishop, or cardinal, or pope, or whatever they do. It doesn't matter. You should know your faith well enough, and you should not allow it to affect your faith at all. It's difficult, but it's part of the spiritual warfare. But this is this indirect. We also suffer it indirectly in relationship to politics. This is one of the reasons why we, as part of spiritual warfare, you have an obligation to vote. The church has reiterated the fact that John Paul II himself even said in one of his documents, each citizen, if they have the right to vote, has an obligation to vote in order to secure the common good for the society. And it's a negligence to do so. It's a sin. You have an obligation to get out there and do this. Because why? Because we have an obligation, as Leo XIII said, and as Pius XI said, and of all the saints have said, especially the popes in the last 150 years, that we have an obligation to establish the kingship of Christ even in the secular sphere. Even in the secular sphere. And that means as citizens of this country, we have an obligation to go and vote for those people who are going to uphold life, that is the values of the church, uphold life, protect the common good, make sure that that the primary thing, and this is an interesting thing, one of the brainchilds of